Hello there and welcome to our L24 special coverage over the Ukraine-Russia war, the so-called special military operation. Russia's defense ministry says its forces have withdrawn from Snake Island, a highly contested island in the Black Sea that Russia occupied soon after its February invasion. Moscow framed the move as an effort to create a humanitarian corridor for the export of agricultural products from Ukraine. Kiev and Moscow have traded 144 prisoners, each in exchange that saw the return of some Ukrainian fighters who defended the Azovstal steel plant during a brutal siege before Russia seized control of Mariupol. On the other hand, off the diplomacy table, NATO leaders have announced a new strategic concept in response to Russia's war against Ukraine, describing Moscow as the most significant and direct threat to the Allies' security and stability. Russian President, on the other hand, as well, Vladimir Putin, issued fresh warnings that Russia would respond in kind if NATO set up a military infrastructure in Finland and Sweden after they joined the US-led alliance. To analyze all this information, I'm joined live by Skype platform by Mr. Eugene Chavsky, a senior analyst and program head at New Lines Institute from Texas, USA, and Adam Kulash, an EU former ambassador from Poland. Gentlemen, thank you so much for accepting our invitation to this debate. The discussion begins right after this break. And before we delve into our discussion, let's start with this report or these clips. On the third day of the NATO summit, US President Joe Biden said that United States will strengthen its military positioning in Europe so that NATO can respond to threats coming from all directions and in all areas.
President Zelensky made clear that Ukraine relies on our continued support, and our message to him was equally clear. Ukraine can count on us for as long as it takes.
We're sending an unmistakable message, in my view, and I think yours as well, that NATO is strong, united, and the steps we're taking during this summit are going to further augment our collective strength. To that end, today I'm announcing the United States will enhance our force posture in Europe and respond to the changed security environment, as well as strengthening our collective security.
Mr. Kulan, since you are a European, I'll be starting with you. The NATO summit is being held in Madrid from the 28th to the 30th from June, which is today. NATO, or rather, let us say US, as Putin claimed, that the main goal behind this summit is to focus over two things. First, to show the world that we are still united and even stronger with the newly applied Scandinavian countries, Finland and Sweden. And secondly, to warn Russia of any other advanced thought to launch another military operation and to stop its operation in Ukraine. But the question, do you think it will work to push back the Russian troops and diplomacy from reaching their goals?
You know, first of all, NATO summit showed an extraordinary unity of the whole alliance. This was demonstrated not only by finally overcoming obstacles for Sweden and Finland to join alliance, but also in adopting new strategic concept of NATO that that is really, I would say, an earthquake in how NATO perceives the security environment. I think the signal to Moscow is that NATO is united, NATO is resolved, NATO will take whatever measures it should take to defend itself, to stand ready for any Russian aggression, and to help Ukraine, withstand the current Russian campaign. Of course, all the things announced by President Biden, strengthening the U.S. forces in Europe. For instance, in Poland, there will be the commandership of the 5th U.S. Army Corps permanently located. But what is, I think, most significant decision by NATO is to increase the number of the troops that can be rapidly deployed, rapid response troops, from 40 to 300,000, which of course will require a lot of infrastructure across the alliance, across many countries. And part of it will be, of course, strengthening the US presence to Europe to around 100,000 troops. And all these measures are, of course, defensive measures.
I'm sorry to cut your train of thought, Mr. Adam. I'm sorry to cut your train of thought. I'm sorry to cut your train of thought, but don't you think that the expansion of the NATO in the eastward Europe is a dangerous move? I mean, it will only raise the tension between the East and the West. Why they don't go for better countries away of Russia? Why they are always trying to get moved toward the Russian territories?
Because I think they see a guarantee for their security and stability in joining the Western system of alliances, be it the European Union on the economic side or NATO on the security side. Both have proven as an effective mechanisms. Both are quite promising for I would say every country, and cooperation, participation, and joining those mechanisms can only increase overall security. I just want to remind that Russia at one point also was a NATO partner. And, in the previous strategic concept of NATO of 2012, Russia was a partner country. But the aggressive policies of Mr. Putin, have changed that perception. And now NATO has declared, in accordance with facts, recognized the fact that Russia is indeed a real threat.
A real threat. Okay, quite understood. Coming to you, Mr. Eugene, US President Joe Biden praised the breakthrough with Turkey, saying it sends a clear signal to Russia that NATO was united and growing since a long time. So, after this statement and the full application of Finland and Sweden, do you think that Turkey and Russia will have remained and keep the good diplomatic relations, or everything is going to change after this event?
No, I don't see any major changes as a result of this event. Turkey has a complex and very nuanced relationship as a NATO member, but one that actually cooperates with Russia, both in the security sphere and economically in terms of energy supplies. Turkey clearly demonstrated some apprehension on Sweden and Finland's NATO accession, but it was able to extract some concessions and negotiate essentially a compromise in order to see those two countries join. I think Russia saw that it was quite clear that the eventuality was that Sweden and Finland would be joining the alliance, and it has its own responses in store, according to Putin. But I don't see this as having a major impact on the relationship between Russia and Turkey.
Quite interesting. Same with you, Mr. Eugene. Ukraine's president is still pleading for more weapons from the EU leaders as well as NATO. So let us say he got what he's asking for. How this will help Ukraine to regain what is already taken? I mean, don't you think it's too late to gain from the Russian troops the Donbas region and the eastern territories?
Well, I think first and foremost, Ukraine is trying to secure these weapons basically to stave off further Russian advances. So we've seen Russia make slow but incremental moves further, especially in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass territory, capturing Severodonetsk most recently. And so while Ukraine would certainly like to retake some of those territories, and it has been able to in other parts of the country, in the north, near Kiev and Kharkiv, and also in the south, closer to Kherson. But I think first and foremost, the goal for Ukraine, and with the Western backing, is to defend its territory, and then it can look to try to reclaim some of what it has already lost.
Great understanding. Now, let's move to the second point to be discussed. Russian President Vladimir Putin said on Wednesday his country's army doesn't strike any civilian targets in Ukraine. Putin made these remarks during a summit with the leaders of the 4 countries along Caspian Sea to discuss regional cooperation and international issues. When he was asked about an attack at the crowded mall, which killed at least 18 people in Kremenchuk on Monday, he also warned that if Finland and Sweden welcomed NATO troops and military infrastructure onto that territory, Russia would respond in a mere manner.
Ukraine is means to protect NATO's own interest, that is, with hands of Ukrainians and the Ukrainian people. NATO members and leading NATO countries simply want to assert themselves, further assert their role in the world, confirm leadership of their hegemony in the truest sense of the word, their imperial ambitions.
Имперские амбиции. Что касается Швеции и Финляндии, у нас нет таких проблем.
As for Sweden and Finland, we don't have such problems with Sweden and Finland that we have with Ukraine, unfortunately. We have no territorial issues or disputes. We have nothing to worry about in terms of membership of Finland and Sweden in NATO. Well, they want it. They only must clearly understand that there were no threats to them before. Now, if military contingents and infrastructure are deployed there, we will have to respond in a mirror manner.
Mr. Kulash, Russian president stated that he had never thought to take any steps against Sweden and Finland because they have never been a threat to Russia. For him, it doesn't matter if they became members of the NATO alliance or not. But if they open their lands for the NATO military brigades, then Russian troops and Russia in general will change its military and political procedures with this latter, especially Finland, that it shares a long border with Moscow. So, to this point, can we consider this is a threat or a defensive statement?
I think Mr. Putin is trying to absorb and admit the reality that he had absolutely no possibility to stop them join NATO. It would have, besides, never really happened without probably the current aggression on Ukraine. So this is the very result of Putin's policies. But I think, if a country joins NATO, earlier or later, NATO infrastructure will encompass that country. And needless to say that both countries already have important military infrastructures, and NATO considers them, as a very important addition to the NATO potential. So there will be not such a big need to move additional NATO infrastructure into Sweden and Finland in the near future. But the statement also, refers to how Mr. Putin thinks about the Russian strategy. His strategy is to recreate the Soviet Union, the Russian empire, at least in parts of the former Soviet Union. So Ukraine was here clearly the major target and element of this policy. He could not have the same ambition towards other countries that have never been part of the Soviet Union. Apart from that, Russia, Soviet Union has a very bitter memory of the Winter War with Finland, 1936, that Soviet troops were not capable of overcoming Finnish defense, and the war really did not end well for the Soviet Union. So it was a war that Russians don't want to really remember, but it is probably a good occasion, to remember that now when Finland joined NATO. So, by the way, as President Biden said very rightfully, Putin wanted to sell Finlandization concept to Eastern European countries like Ukraine, but now instead he got NATOization of Finland, Sweden, and and the whole Western Europe really got united also behind the NATO as an alliance.
Perfect, very good indeed. Mr. Eugene, you are an American, and I'm deadly certain that you are aware of the relationship between Russia and US in a very good manner. In Putin's press conference, he kept saying that the NATO is not moving forward to the Russian borders just like that. It's a US-made decision. Always it has been and always will be, because we are Russia, not Iran, not any other country. If they take us down, it means two birds with one stone, because US, since the Cold War and even earlier, they think of us as a threat and an enemy, and they are using NATO alliance for their best interests. Is that true? Are the NATO countries has nothing to say but only to follow US orders?
Well, I think that's certainly an exaggeration from Putin's standpoint. The U.S. is a leading country of NATO. That's true as the world's largest military. But NATO is an alliance that votes and makes decisions through unanimity, which we've now seen in terms of the response to the Ukraine conflict, now with the expansion to Finland and Sweden. So it's understandable from Putin's perspective, I suppose, that he sees all NATO actions through the prism of the U.S. But just as we've seen, because of the war that Putin launched in Ukraine, Sweden and Finland, which were previously non-aligned countries, and public opinion was quite low in terms of NATO membership, that's been reversed completely. And I don't think the U.S., was a major factor in that, other than being one of the important countries of the alliance that looks for the security of its members and also of NATO-aligned countries like Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Quite interesting. Some of the reports, they are saying that Biden is the major factor for this military operation because he didn't at all negotiate with Putin. What are you saying about this? Because Russia could have made this military operation years ago. Why they have done it in the Biden administration?
Well, that's a question, I suppose, to ask Vladimir Putin. But I think that it's true. There was negotiations leading up to the conflict, quite extensive ones, a lot of diplomacy, not only from the U.S., but also the Europeans. But I think the issue here was that, Russia was seeking or essentially demanding security guarantees, not only in terms of Ukraine not being allowed NATO integration or membership, but also moving NATO forces back to pre-97 lines, which I think is unrealistic. The U.S. position and the NATO position is that, these countries have a right to self-determination. I think that there could have been more diplomacy pursued, from both the Russian and the Western sides, rather than trying to impose their respective positions. But clearly, Putin decided that that was not going to be successful, and he opted for a military, essentially, answer to the conflict, which has led to all of the repercussions that we have been talking about.
Perfectly understood. Mr. Kulash, coming back to you, as a European, don't you really think that this war in Ukraine is harmful only for Europe, as it was the WW2, and US is only pushing the escalation forward, And this war, it serves United States cause, which is the first, creating a united front against the military rival Russia, and on the other hand, secondly, to weaken the EU economy, which is also a competitor to US economy. Another two birds with one stone. This is why they want the war to go as long as they want. Don't you agree with that?
This is very close to Mr. Putin's perspective of things. But the real perspective is that now we have, two realities really confronted, and two concepts of international relations. One is based on domination, power, imposition, and this is how Mr. Putin sees things. That's why he thinks he can only negotiate with peers, and for peers he may consider only the United States or maybe China to a certain extent. But he cannot understand that the other side really represents the world based on rules, based on cooperation, based on free choices of people, based on democratic mechanisms, based on the public opinion real influence on policies of the countries. Mr. Putin doesn't really take into consideration what people think. If they approve his policies, that's okay. But if they don't, he doesn't see it as an obstacle. But he really cannot understand that the world can function otherwise. That's probably why he decided at one point in 2011-12 probably that he chose a confrontation rather than cooperation. He chose this path of, as I said before, recreation of the Soviet Union type of empire. So he has dominated completely Belarusia. He thought he has dominated Kazakhstan, but it proved to be not the case exactly as he thought, as we saw some proofs recently. But he also thought about the same for Ukraine. He thought about the same for the Caucasus countries, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. So that was, his way of imagining things. That countries formerly being part of the Russian zone of influence should really remain in the same position. Understood. But time never stops. Times changes and realities changes, and Mr. Putin still lives in the past.
Understood. So he's just still imagining. Mr. Eugene, Putin stated that he is not taking the period of this military operation into consideration. I mean, he's not worried about the time that might take to reach his goals. He said, we are ready in all fields to take as long as they want. Mostly important, I will reach my goal, which is to have a full control over the Donbas region and end the Ukrainian threat and its Nazism. Don't you think this is a very wise word in terms of strategic politics to show his enemies that I am waiting and I am winning the war and I don't care about your actions, and at the same time to let his soldiers and even the Russian citizens feel comfortable over their lives and their future?
Well, I think that Putin has certainly made it clear that the military operations will continue at the very least until Russia is able to gain control of all of Donbass, which they're making some slow and steady gains. But this could take several more months, if not longer, depending on the Ukrainian resistance and Western support for Ukraine. But the timing is not completely up to Putin, I think, in this case, because while we've seen Russia's economy have some level of resilience, particularly in the energy sector due to the higher prices as a result of the war, I think sanctions and other economic restrictions against Russia will be increasingly felt over the coming months and years if it takes that long. So essentially, there's a number of factors that will determine at what point Russia will stop the military operations and really become serious about negotiating a political settlement of some sort. Because I think Russia is not serious about that until it achieves at least some of those military objectives.
Quite understood. Now, let's tackle this Zelensky that affirmed that Wednesday, Ukraine carried out its biggest exchange of prisoners of war, securing the release of 144 of its soldiers from the Russian captivity. Of those released, 95 were involved in defending the Azovstal steel plants in Ukraine's devastated southern city of Mariupol before Russian forces captured it weeks ago.
We have returned home 144 Ukrainian fighters from Russian captivity, including 59 National Guard fighters, 38 Navy fighters, 28 Armed Force fighters, 17 border guards and 1 policeman. The oldest among the released fighters is 65 years old, the youngest is 19. In particular, 95 Azovstal defenders are coming home.
Mr. Ulash, coming back to you, Mr. How can you read these actions from the two angles? I mean, from the Russian one as the Ukrainian one, the release of 144 soldiers.
I think, any exchange of prisoners is a good sign. For Ukraine, clearly, is even double good that among those released were defenders of Azovstal in Mariupol. Those remembering those days know that Putin was describing all those defending Mariupol as Nazis, as staunchest nationalists, not deserving the status of a regular army if they are in captivity. So everybody was afraid what would happen to those people once they are kept. But I think it's a good sign from this perspective. From Mr. Putin's perspective, I think he deliberately probably released those who are really with amputated arms, with really heavy wounds, to maybe use this as a kind of psychological effect that this is what will happen to every Ukrainian defender if he really fights to the end. But overall, I see the exchange of prisoners as something that should be seen positive on both sides. At least on the Ukrainian side, I hope.
Quite understood. Mr. Eugene, to which side it's really more profitable and beneficial, this prisoners exchange, to the Russian side or the Ukrainian? And what can you read between the lines between this in this event?
That it's good for both sides. And I think it's a positive sign that, at least on a tactical level, there can be some progress made in this conflict. So we've seen not only the prisoner exchange, but as you had mentioned earlier, Russia withdrawing from Snake Island, which at least can hopefully pave the way for some kind of grain supplies to resume. So this just goes to show that there are, even as the war continues and doesn't show any signs of ending anytime soon, there are opportunities for at least some tactical cooperation between Russia and Ukraine and the West. So the more that those kinds of elements can be built on, hopefully that can be leveraged into a broader resolution. But as I mentioned, I think strategically, I don't think we're unfortunately close to there yet.
Mr. Adam, probably this might be the last question due to the time. Europe's unity over the war in Ukraine is at risk as public attention increasingly shifts from the battlefield to cost of living concerns. A survey in 9 EU member states found that despite strong support across Europe for Ukraine's bid to join the EU and the West's policy of cutting ties with Moscow, many voters in Europe want the war to end as soon as possible, even if that means Ukraine losing territory. What are you saying about this?
You know, it's clear that the war has created a situation that is impacting European economy. But still, you know, despite those polls, the European public is united in one thing, in seeing that Russia is really here a perpetrator, an aggressor, that you know, that it needs to be somehow put into accountability, or brought into accountability, and you know, this has not changed. As in every war, you know, if it continues for a long time, any support anywhere would be more and more problematic, and this is normal. This also reflects a democratic nature of the European Union. That you know, all those feelings and people's concerns are never hidden and are freely expressed. So I don't think it will really undermine the Europe's resolve in helping Ukraine.
Perfectly understood. Mr. Adam Kulash, an EU former ambassador from Poland. Mr. Eugene Czałswiecki from USA, thank you ever so much for participating with us in this debate. Thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here with us on L24 News. Take care of yourself and have a blessed day.